Ukraine's president says Russia has launched a new offensive in the eastern region of Donetsk and Luhansk. Volodymyr Zelensky announced last night that the battle for the Donbas had begun, and Ukraine's military says Russian forces are attacking positions along the entire 300-mile front line. Moscow's also repeated its demand for Ukrainian and foreign fighters to surrender in Mariupol. Russian-backed separatists claim special forces are now storming the city's steelworks, despite pictures emerging which purportedly show women and children taking shelter inside the plant. Russia's defense ministry says its missile and artillery forces struck 1,260 targets in Ukraine overnight. There'll be no evacuation corridors open in Ukraine for the third consecutive day. The country's deputy prime minister says efforts to create safe passage for civilians to leave have repeatedly failed. The regional governor of Luhansk says the eastern city of Kremenina is now under Russian control. Ukrainian troops have had to withdraw and take up new positions. And the commander of the Azov regiment of the Ukrainian National Guard says Russia has begun dropping bunker buster bombs on a steel plant in Mariupol where Ukrainian forces are refusing to surrender. I'm joined now to discuss all of this and much more by Air Marshal Phil Osborn, former Chief of the Defence Intelligence Staff and a Director at Universal Defence and Security Solutions. Great to see you again, Phil. And let's touch, first of all, on the big picture. And it feels like this is a critical moment in this war now.
Yeah, I think so. Day 55. This is something the Russians have been working up to for some weeks, trying to regroup and rebuild, frankly, some pretty shattered military units coming round from Kyiv and the rest of Russia to really come at the east and probably to focus on some revised war aims, which is to take the whole of the Donbas. Let's
dive into that particular region. And what do you think are the key areas of focus for the Russians, first of all, in the coming days in this area?
So the Russians will, I think it's fairly clear to say this offensive has started and they're into a preparatory phase and actually starting to advance. So they're declaring some 1,260 targets hit overnight, and the Ukrainians actually have accepted that Crimea, with a loss of some 200 civilians, has been taken under Russian control. I think we can expect the Russians to focus on advancing or trying to advance in the east with supporting efforts to the north and the south, hopefully from their perspective, seeking to encircle well-dug-in Ukrainian forces.
Well, let's touch on those Ukrainian forces then. What is their key strategy to repel this Russian advance?
So they've been there for 8 years. They'll have defended the front line as they see it, but also urban areas. They'll be tired. There is the risk of being overwhelmed. The ground more suits manoeuvre warfare from a Russian perspective, so they can bring that advantage of numbers to bear. But I think it's fair to say they've got some things going for them. They're hugely motivated, as we've seen. And also the Russians, to change the way they've been fighting is a fairly steep ask of them. They've been pretty average thus far, and therefore it's quite a shift from a Russian point of view to be quite different in the way they approach warfare at this stage.
Are there any, whilst we stick on this image, any areas that they're pushing back actively on or just repelling these Russian advances?
So the Ukrainians will be seeking to put pressure on Russia in different places of the theatre. So, for example, I think we can expect to see some counterattacks in the north, to the North Izium. There's a well-established supply route coming north from Russia down in towards the Donbas region. I think we can also see some counterattacks in the south around Kherson, again trying to fix Russian forces in the south and stopping them reinforce that eastern offensive.
Really fascinating. We'll see how all of that plays out over the coming weeks, Phil. But let's now just dive in to Mariupol, which of course we touched on already, but go in more detail. And somewhat amazingly, Ukrainian forces continue to resist the Russian advances. What's going on in Mariupol?
I think you're right. I think this is probably a tone from a whole of Ukrainian point of view, to be fair. This is a really hard target from a Russian point of view. And I think the Ukrainians have surprised us all by hanging on as long as they have. In amongst the horror of Mariupol, this is serving a purpose of fixing Russian forces in the south. So again, part of that, trying to distract Russia from its offensive in the east.
Phil, great stuff. Thanks so much for joining me, as always, Phil Osborn.